Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Tech Tuesday webinar series. I am your moderator today, Kevin Marheine, joined today by Chris Shalda, one of our senior solution architects here at Core Tech Services. He is on our cloud solutions team. And before I hand it over to Chris to talk about our topic of the day, which is Azure cost optimization, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If you registered for this webinar, we will be sending you a recording of it. So whether you're here in person today and you want to just come back and take a look at the material that Chris presented, or if you registered in advance knowing you wouldn't be able to join us today, this recording will be sent out. It'll either be going out this afternoon or tomorrow morning, depending on when the recording is made available to us. We'll also be sending out a copy of the slide deck, so you'll have that to reference as well. And then throughout the course of today's presentation, if you do have any questions, please feel free to submit those using the GoToWebinar interface. There will be a brief period towards the ends of the presentation where we'll be able to address any questions that you might have. With that, and without any further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to Chris, who will go ahead and walk us through the presentation he's prepared today.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. This is definitely a topic I feel like many organizations could take advantage of here is Azure cost optimization. Just a little bit more about me. I work with a lot of different Azure customers through different licensing mechanisms and different stages of their cloud journeys, whether they're just starting off or they're very mature. And I find that when I'm able to dig in with them, there's always something that we can be doing to help optimize costs here within Azure. So I'm hoping to bring together some of the kind of guidance that might be scattered throughout the interwebs, if you will, as well as some of my personal experiences to give you some cohesive ideas, strategies, best practices around where you can start optimizing your costs in Azure. So we're gonna get started here and give you an idea of the agenda. We're gonna start with cost savings ideas, those strategies and best practices. And I'm going to walk you through kind of the basic, intermediate, and advanced kind of recommendations that I would have for you to consider. We're going to get into, how do you avoid unnecessary costs in Azure? And then also, how do you track the costs in Azure besides just saving costs? So more kind of operational and governance types of topics. Then I want to introduce a new offer that we have, was a Azure cost optimization offer, and then offer you guys some other ideas around where Core Tech can help if you should need it. Okay, so to get started here, I do have to start with this caution, just to put things into context. Regarding cost savings, when you're thinking about cost savings, you're probably thinking, oh, my bill is this much money, I'm gonna take this much and I'm gonna reduce it, my bill by this much for Azure. And yes, that is cost savings, but you oftentimes need to take a step back from an organization perspective, look at the TCO, the total cost of ownership overall, which is more than typically just your Azure bill in terms of your IT costs, right? You have people costs and there's other technologies and tools and other things that, maybe for some organizations, there's financial penalties if they don't hit a certain uptime or something like that, right? For their customers, for their applications. So you have to think about a total cost of ownership, not just let's just shave down and be as cheap as we can on the Azure bill. There might be areas you might actually strategically spend more and overall save on a total cost of ownership, if you will. Also be careful of what's called over optimization. So you might get pinching the pennies and making those sizes of those VMs really tiny, but at the end of the day, it may affect the system performance and at the end of the day, the poor user experience with that. So be careful about over optimizing. It's all about right sizing. And lastly, to be successful with cloud, it really does warrant taking an iterative approach across the board. And you're going to see this theme, I think, kind of speckled throughout here, as basically the idea is you start with some sort of MVP, is what it's called, a minimal viable product of what you're trying to achieve here, and a baseline, initial costs and that you're spending right now, and then you have the intention of building upon and iterating across that and doing something better in the next time, instead of not doing anything at all for 12 months because you got to figure everything out before you move, and start using, let's say, Azure for anything, right? So it's all about starting small, figure out what's the minimal needed here, and then continuing to iterate to gain the value, right? So let's get into the cost savings best practices. So we're starting here with the basic, which I'm going to call crawl. So kind of think of this as crawl, walk, and run as far as it's going to depend on where you're already at in your journey with Azure, and kind of what makes sense in terms of how much effort is going to be put into these cost savings. With what I'm starting with, the basic is going to be kind of the low-hanging fruit, the least amount of efforts in order to get some benefits, let's just say, and least amount of changes to underlying kind of infrastructure and applications. And as we go to intermediate and advanced, they're going to require some more changes in the applications, infrastructure, processes, that type of thing. So that's how I've kind of laid this out here. So as we're crawling here, the first thing to look at is using Azure Advisor. This is a free tool that everybody has access to within Azure. You should be reviewing this regularly. It actually is looking at a lot of your resources in your own environment and saying things like, hey, we've been looking at these resources for over 30 days and it looks like they're oversized, or it looks like you should use a reserved instance, or it looks like this, you should be doing this. There are some cost optimization kind of tips directly in context to your environment from that. So I would definitely start there. And some of these other ideas that we're going to have in here, best practices, are some of the things that Azure Advisor pulls up typically automatically for you. Cleaning up forgotten and orphaned resources. So we do see this a lot. You know, it is what it is. It happens. You have VMs, let's just say, and you do using for testing, or they were there temporarily and you delete them, or maybe you don't delete them, you just forget about them. But a lot of times you might delete a VM, and I think it's a little bit better now. There are some capabilities to delete the disks along with the VMs, but prior to just recently, disks might just be sitting out there, not being attached to anything, and they're just kind of just spinning the needle, right, on your Azure consumption. So you should be looking through and see any disks that are not attached to VMs, any VMs that are maybe turned off and not, maybe they're just powered off but not deallocated, for example. So they're still spending money on the compute side. Any storage accounts that are out there that are not being used, NICs, etc., right? Any old dev and testing resources. So that's a good thing to kind of look through and make sure that those things just have a good hygiene for that. Right sizing resources. This is a pretty simple thing. Like, the general guidance is after more than 90 days, if resources are still looking underutilized, then that is a good time to maybe lower the size of that virtual machine, right? So you don't want to do too aggressively, right? Just in case there are some peaks, right? And sometimes it's seasonally or, you know, cyclically, like month end, that type of thing. That's why giving about 90 days, say, hey, this has been underutilized for 90 days. Let's knock down the size a little bit here. And also selecting the right VM family, right? If you need to have like more CPU to RAM, right, in terms of ratio wise, then an F series is going to be best for you, for example, or more RAM to CPU. You need E series maybe, or if your workloads are burstable, then a B series for burstables, might be the right way to go. So just making sure that you're best utilizing resource between RAM and CPU, and choosing the right size for that ratio for your application. And another one here is optimizing Azure Blob Storage. So, you know, selecting the best tier for your needs, hot, cool, or archive. By default, typically is hot. If you have data that needs to stay around for a while but don't need to access it as much, then cool might make sense, or even archive if you can tolerate, you know, some hours between when you need it and when it's available for you. The costs go way down as you go towards archive. So that's something to consider there. And not only that, you can now automate access tiers here of moving data between, you know, from hot to cool to archive based on some policies and lifecycle management. Basically, that's built in. You just set some policies in Azure to set that, and kind of does it for you in the background. Also selecting the appropriate redundancy options. So more so, I guess, like if you selected more of a geo-redundant, you really don't need geo-redundant, right? Moving it back to a locally redundant, that type of thing, that will save money. But on the other hand, too, good time to look at this and say, do I need redundancy? If I don't have it, hey, that's a good reason to add redundancy as well, knowing that it will cost a little bit more, but that could save you some costs in the long run. For example, if you were to lose that data, if it's only locally redundant, for example. And some other ideas on the basic side would be optimizing licensing. So again, you kind of notice all these things they're not impactful directly to how workloads are going to run, how they're going to work, but these are changing things kind of on the outside, so minimal impact. And optimizing licensing, so I'm talking specifically Windows Server, SQL Server. If you have Azure Hybrid benefits through software assurance, utilizing that as much as possible, that will definitely reduce your costs as opposed to paying as you go for those licensing in Azure, which is by default. If you don't select AHB, Azure Hybrid benefit, when you have those license benefits, you're paying more, right? Or the other option is software subscriptions. That might be a little newer concept. That's specifically through the CSP program, Cloud Solution Provider program, where you can buy 1 or 3 year subscriptions for Windows Server and SQL Server instead of using that pay-as-you-go licensing if you don't already have software assurance. I'd definitely recommend you check out one of my previous webinars here that I did as demystifying Microsoft licensing in Azure. I dive into a lot of those different areas, give a lot of tips around that too, so I won't go too deep into that today. Another one is kind of lastly here for basic is use Azure reservations where applicable. And I say where applicable because if you do have workloads that are going to be very temporary, let's say, or you're going to be keeping those workloads only on for less than 50% of the time, Azure reservations may not make sense. But for most things that are going to be on a lot and you think you're going to be running them for a while, you can save a significant amount of money with Azure reservations. So these are, I just listed some of the major ones I've seen that in use, like virtual machines, Azure Storage, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Database, the vCore-based types, Azure Synapse Analytics, App Service, the stamp fee when you're using the ASE, the App Service environments, Azure Database, so those OSS databases, open source, MySQL, Postgres, MariaDB, Azure Cache Redis, and there's even more. So if you have any of those services today, definitely look into whether if there's running ongoing, check and see what the reservations look like, because you will definitely save some money if you run a reservation on that. And most of these reservations have a monthly payment and just a commitment term of 1 or 3 years. So you don't have to pay it all up front. You can if you want to, but in most cases, it's just part of the monthly. So your monthly cost ends up going down. You're just saying, yeah, I'm going to keep this on running for at least a year or 3 years, that type of thing. And also consider moving from any non-eligible VM families, because I've seen this before. For example, like an A series, there's not too many out there still, but like an A series, for example, and some of the really older versions I've seen of the VM series where I think Microsoft is phasing them out. They don't want you to get on reservations for those for long term. Move to a different VM series. If you're on an A series, maybe you look at an F series or a D series, some sort of equivalent there, and the savings of the reservations would typically make sense to do that. So to give you an idea kind of graphically here, looking at if you're to combine go back here, see if it loads properly. Went too far. So I have a graphic of the Azure Hybrid benefit as well as, there it is, the reserved instance, kind of putting that together. Now this is from a virtual machine perspective, right? Assuming this is a Windows virtual machine. So just looking at this, if you're in pay-as-you-go for the Windows Server licenses and also for the compute, you go down and you just apply the Azure Hybrid benefit. You can get a 40% savings right there. And if you just applied the Azure RI, the reserved instance there, at the 3 year, you could save 72% just on the compute. You combine both of them, it could be 82%. So that's significant savings, this is usually where I start, honestly, it's low-hanging fruit. Look for if you have Azure Hybrid benefit, or maybe invest in some software subscriptions if you don't have that otherwise, and take advantage of reservations where you can. Can take a huge chunk right off the top. Great, so now we get into intermediate. So here's our walking stage. So on the intermediate side, looking at things like power management of dev, tests, and staging, potentially even production, depending on how that might be used, but mostly in the dev test stage, right, where you don't need to have those up all the time. Let's say VMs, even sometimes it might be a managed instance or that type of thing, where you need it, but during working hours, for example, you might do an auto shutdown for that after a certain, after 6 p.m. on a weekday, you shut it down, right? So, or at the same time, you could potentially auto start it at 7 a.m. on the weekday, right? So that it's ready to go for when everybody comes back into the office. You do that based on schedule. You can automate it based on a trigger. We did a really cool thing. We had a demo environment we wanted to stand up for Citrix on Azure, and multiple people at CoreTech needed to be able to use it at any point in time, but we didn't want to spend for all those resources just sitting out there turned on. It required a number of different servers running. And we didn't do demos like, it's like constantly, right? It was like, this day and a few days later do a demo, that type of thing. So what we did is we actually set up a automation using basically an Exchange Online, like Outlook calendar, shared calendar, saying, okay, we add an appointment to it, and basically it gets approved in some back-end process. I'm gonna say, yep, that's cool, you can do that. Once that appointment date and time come up, it's like an hour before that, it would warm up the environment, start it all up, kick it all off, automate kind of the power on sequence, and then it would stay on for the duration of that appointment on that calendar appointment. And then at the end, it would automatically just shut everything down. So that's the beauty of Azure in some ways, is that it is a utility with consumption where you can only use it for when it's turned on. So that's definitely a way to take advantage of that. Other thing is assess your database usage and sizing. So are you using Azure SQL? Are you using the right Azure SQL type between a single database, elastic database, hyperscale, serverless, right? If you're using a bunch of single databases, maybe it makes sense to put an elastic database pool and kind of share some of the resources into that. Or might be looking at serverless, where essentially you can go down to pausing the database when it's not in use, and just a little bit of warm-up time, everything comes back up. If it's really not used as often and very occasionally, that's a very good way to reduce some costs. Cosmos DB, looking at the units, collection, replicas, and how those are kind of architected, that might be a little bit more advanced type of thing, but making sure that's done optimally. Looking at the different ways to purchase Cosmos DB between provisioned RU, the request units, or now a serverless with auto scaling essentially. With that, you don't have to say I want specifically this many request units. You can allow it to scale within certain ranges for you as needed automatically. File server shared storage. So if you have SIF storage, your normal network shares that you might have on Windows servers, especially if you migrated things legacy into Azure, you might consider things like Azure Files, even Azure File Sync for a kind of a way for on-prem users to get to it a little bit quicker. And also, you might look at something like a third party. We've worked a lot with Infinity lately. They have a pretty great solution where, especially you need to do some distributed files and access from multiple locations, they have a pretty slick solution. So that might be something to look into as well. We're seeing that kind of replace a lot of those enterprise file shares within organizations, including within Azure. So on to our advanced. So here's our running stage. On the advanced side, this is where we're going to talk about doing a little bit more typically in terms of the time it might take and the complexity here to reduce some costs. First is modernizing your applications. So instead of having them just running on a virtual machine, for example, kind of traditionally legacy-wise, you might look at making it more modern. And I'm going to kind of walk through the different ways here. And in a lot of ways, it could reduce some costs depending on what your kind of the way that you're set up today, especially if you have a lot of needs around, high availability and DR, which are already built up really well and mature within your application today. You get a lot of that just built into a lot of the Azure like PaaS services, the platform as a service options. I kind of mentioned some ideas here. So for refactoring would be maybe your first step there, where this is a little lower complexity. That's the least amount of return here, but there's minimal change needed. This is really just kind of changing, maybe putting your code, instead of putting it on a VM and IaaS, you're putting it on a Azure App Service and letting Azure kind of run the backend components there. Same idea with Azure SQL Managed Instance, high compatibility with your legacy SQL servers, just kind of shifting that over to that without making a lot of changes. That would be the first step, maybe a refactor. Or maybe you want to re-architect some things with your application. You're okay with making some code changes, some architectural changes. This is a little more complexity. You have potential for more return here, but there definitely is some change that you're going to have to make. Things like in this area would be maybe moving your applications to containers and using an orchestrator like Azure Kubernetes Service, which, by the way, the orchestrator that there is free. You don't have to pay for any of those backend management servers, which is really great there. And Azure SQL database, so like the single DB, the elastic DB pool, there's that hyperscale, the serverless, right? Those do require typically a little more change if you're coming from legacy SQL, but they do have some interesting capabilities there, especially around the serverless and hyperscale. And the kind of last one here is rebuilding. So if you're like, all right, my app is kind of old, limited functionality, we need to do something pretty major here. Maybe you rebuild in a cloud native standpoint, or you're just building something brand new, right? So this is where you're going to be a little higher complexity here, especially if you're moving from some legacy application, right? But can have the most return, is most change. This is where you start getting into more kind of serverless ideas of, and serverless, by the way, it means that the compute resources are allocated dynamically and they instantly auto scale to meet elastic demands. Serverless does not mean no server, but think of it as like less server, right? So server less, less of a server, because the servers run only as needed and your resources aren't dedicated specifically to a server like it is in other cases. And so like Azure Functions, for example, they run only as needed on demand, and they're like per second build, that type of thing. And that's when you get into more event-driven application architectures. So a good place to start here, if you're interested, check out one of my other previous webinars I did on app modernization in Microsoft Azure. So these are all available on the Core Tech YouTube site under the Tech Topics playlists. And I think we're going to also include the links in the description there as well, so that you can get to them easily. The auto scale of your application. So if you are using VMs and your VMs are idempotent, meaning that they're basically stateless, if you will, they're not, they don't have like specifics. The VMs aren't, I guess, customized differently. They're all just very based off of a template, and they're spun up and spun down. You can use VM scale sets for that if you're still using VMs for those services. If you're using Azure PaaS services, a lot of the PaaS services already have auto scaling capabilities. You just got to tweak them and turn them on, basically. So that's usually low-hanging fruit there. And lastly, in the advanced is client caching and content compression. So if you have a lot of content that the end client is pulling over the internet, you do have to pay for egress charges from Azure. So if you were to maybe store some of that content, maybe static content or media type of stuff in a CDN, so a content delivery network at the edge, that can save you a significant amount of money, as opposed to that getting pulled every single time from your Azure subscription all the way down to the client. And the end user experience most likely to be better with that too. Okay, so let's get into the unnecessary cost avoidance and cost tracking. So a lot of this really comes down to governance, right? So the governance around your costs. One of the major things, the first thing and the thing that needs to be done, and if it's one takeaway here for controlling costs, is tag all of your resources, right? Tag them all, because if you do not tag them, you're gonna at some point be like, well, what's this resource for? Can we get rid of it? Well, I don't know. What is it part of? It's part of a certain application, it's part of a certain environment, who owns it? And you'll be like, well, I don't want to cause any problems, so maybe we just leave it there. Well, that's not always good. Also, if you're doing chargeback or showback to kind of allocate budgets and see how much different groups are spending within Azure, tagging is pretty critical to that as well. So would highly recommend that. You can set policies to automatic tag things depending on where they're being created in. A lot of options around that. Automated budget alerts. So kind of tied to this too, but essentially using Azure resource groups in setting budgets on those and being able to send alerts once a budget is met or exceeded. Options there. There's actually some guidance Microsoft provided around using logic apps and runbooks with the budgets API specifically for that. And you do need to consider, you need to estimate costs for planning new workloads. How do you know what your kind of budget's going to be, your target's going to be, if you don't already do your kind of cost estimates? Now, this is somewhat of an art as much as this is a science here, but the tool that I use is just the Azure calculator. There are some things in there that are just not necessarily as straightforward around some of the rules around what you need. So it does help to have somebody that's experienced to kind of help you through that. I work with customers all the time on this. And yeah, it's definitely, it's a little bit of a learning curve there. So just don't get frustrated, but use that tool and try to understand, use a lot of the help menus within that to make sure you're getting the right costs. RBAC, so role-based access control and subscription architecture. So a lot of this too is kind of like just controlling the costs of having the right people with the right roles, who can create what and which subscriptions, having subscriptions that might be for prod versus non-prod. This all kind of comes into play for cost governance too. So here's a little bit of a graphic here, kind of explaining around the tagging side of things of, you usually start from financial business. They need to be able to break out the costs for these different things by, whether it's certain customer, certain application, a certain environment, and maybe certain cost centers that are custom to you. So you need to create roles with appropriate permissions that kind of tie to these different environments, and always tag those resources. You can say it forces an owner tag every time a resource is created, a department tag, an environment tag, an application tag, right? You can actually enforce that with Azure policy. So ensuring that those are in place, make sure all those resources are tagged there. And the last piece here is around a little bit more on the governance side, more of the Azure governance, which does tie into the cost too, is don't enable shadow IT, right? Meaning that essentially you're enabling shadow IT. If you're locking things down so much that your users can't get done what they need to get done, you need to empower your users to get done what they need to get done, putting in the guardrails for them while governing the spend, right? So it's kind of like with Azure. If you can allow certain users to deploy resources, but you're tracking that spend and you're governing the spend, then they're going to take the path of least resistance, right? And they're going to use the stuff that you're providing instead of them going off the credit card and doing something on their own, right? Use the Azure policies. I mentioned this before about tagging, but you can also set governance guardrails like, okay, you're only allowed to spin up these VM sizes in these specific regions. Is one example, right? Yeah, you can't spin up the Godzilla VM, right? That's just going to make the meter run faster than you've ever seen. You can only do these specific sizes here because you shouldn't need to have anything else besides that. It's a way to kind of control those costs, kind of preventing mistakes from being made, right? It does require planning, communication, regular checks to make sure everybody's on the same page with what you're doing and what the governance is. You need to perform that initial forecasting, like I mentioned, of costs, but you will refine ongoing as you learn it. So look at that, look at the cost monthly. Identify any of those misalignments of like, hey, we expected it to be this cost, and a month later it's more. Okay, let's dig into that. Why is it more? Do we need to change our assumptions? Did we leave something running improperly? Did somebody use the wrong size? Let's figure that out, and let's put in some more governance around that so that we don't have that problem going in the future. And then just review and adjust those plans overall quarterly, right? So just, again, this is an iterative approach here. So just really quickly, cost management tools. There's Azure Cost Management that's built in, has some decent functionality in there. You can buy third-party tools as well to help with cost management. CoreTech specifically has created something called the CoreTech AMS suite, so the Azure Management Suite, which we provide to our customers at no cost, all of our CSP customers. This gives a great view of financial information. You can look at tagging reports, predictive analytics and forecasting. Budget alerts can be in here, and a number of other pieces that kind of gets tied into one dashboard. So something that we do offer for our customers. So kind of wrapping things up, hopefully those are great, ideas and things that you can take and start running with, or at least planning with, to get some cost savings, optimizing your Azure spend. One thing that we are starting to offer right now, this is brand new, is a free cost optimization workshop. So if you'd like to have someone from CoreTech, it might be me, maybe somebody else, to take a look at what you're doing already in Azure, just to give you some ideas around cost optimization. We are offering that right now. Just ensure, get in touch with us to see if you qualify, and really just spending some time taking a look at overall and making some recommendations. There's a number of things I talked about today that we would kind of help you understand and see where your kind of plan is next for that, and if there's anywhere else that we can help you with. But the cost optimization workshop itself is at no cost to you. And the cloud adoption framework, I did bring a lot of things here from the govern aspects here. This is something important too for your organization. If you have not gone through this, you should be going through this at a baseline level and then continually iterating upon this. This is provided by Microsoft. We do have engagements we run with our customers to help them on this framework to ensure that they have everything kind of figured out. Because if you do not have the right footing when you start off, there's a lot of risk there where you might not be able to control your costs very well, or the performance may not be good, or security may not be good, and a number of things that are just going to be obstacles on your way through your cloud journey. So we'd be happy to help you to understand the framework and to execute on that. Last couple things, I kind of mentioned before, CoreTech is a cloud solution provider. We do provide a lot of benefits with that program, and something that you'd like to consider. We can basically it's just a different way of purchasing Azure, but it includes a lot of things like support and actually some built-in time with me, actually, in an architectural type of strategy workshops and advisory services. So that's some of the benefits there. We are an Azure Expert MSP going through our audit today, actually, to renew that. Very stringent program, one of the top kind of accolades, I guess, or certifications from Microsoft in the Azure space for partners. There's only about 70 of these of us in the world in terms of these partners that have this designation, something we're very proud of, and we spend a lot of time to maintain because it just elevates our status and it allows us to help our customers in various ways here. So that's kind of it here. Let's see if I can take some questions. Let me take a look at the chat and see if we have some questions here. I see one. But did you have anything, Kevin? I see one I'm going to start with, and then let me know if you see any others. The first one was, if we wanted to move our Azure to your CSP, is that a difficult process? So it depends on kind of where you're at right now. It's not that difficult, at least on your side necessarily. CoreTech would take on a lot of that effort for you at no cost. So if you're on an EA, typically we can do a very easy flip because we're an Azure Expert MSP. We have that capability to do that without having to really change anything. If you're on like a pay-as-you-go type subscription, there's like a resource move involved, but we would do all the planning and kind of the legwork for you to get to our CSP. It's a good question. Is there anything else, Kevin, that you saw there?
Yep, we have one other question here.
Okay.
And it is there an easy to understand VM family matrix?
Good question. Oh, yeah, that's a little bit difficult. Again, that's a little bit more the art than the science. But if you do a web search for Azure VM sizes, and with probably one of the top results there, it'll be broken out into different types of VM families. And what that does is that gives you an idea of like here's the general purpose types, and here are the compute optimized, storage optimized, and it'll give you kind of an idea of what the VM families are. If I can include a link in here, maybe I'll do that after the fact here. But good question, because that is definitely more of an art than a science, and it's not very easily visible otherwise. Cool. So any other questions there, Kevin?
Looks like that was the only other one we have. So I know we are 2 minutes over. So Chris, want to start it out by just thanking you for your time today and going through the presentation here today. I think there was a lot of great material in here, and certainly appreciate you taking the time to walk everybody through it.
Absolutely. And if anybody has anything that you'd like to talk to us about, see if you want to go for the free optimization offer, or see where else CoreTech can help you, I left our email address here, just inquiry@coretech.com. We'll get you the right person, get somebody in contact with you. I'm looking forward to helping you throughout your cloud journey if that makes sense.
Fantastic. Great. And as per usual, we'll be sending out the recording and today's presentation as well, so you'll have access to that. Whether you were here today or if you're checking us out on demand, you'll be able to view at your leisure. And until, actually we are off next week. There won't be one next week with the Thanksgiving holiday, but we will be returning on December 1st is the next one, Tuesday, December 1st. And that one is taking a look at backup as a service, and Jim Hunter, our CISA, will be joining me for that one. So Chris, again, thank you for your time today. Thank everybody for tuning in. We'll be getting the recording out to you as soon as possible, and we'll catch you during the next Tech Tuesday webinar. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic rest of your afternoon.